Hi, everyone, and welcome to this session of the seminar. Today, it's a great pleasure for me to have with us Professor Scott Churchill from the University of Dallas. Professor Churchill began studying existential phenomenology back in 1969 at Bucknell University and continued his study at Dartmouth University, where he earned his doctorate in clinical phenomenological psychology in 1984. He began his professional career at the University of Dallas in 1981, where he currently holds the position of professor, having earlier served as department chair and founding director of its master programs in psychology. A fellow of the American Psychological Association, Scott has been editor-in-chief of the APA journal, The Humanistic Psychology, since 2006, after serving as editor of Methods, a journal of human sciences, for 15 years. Is a founding member of the Interdisciplinary Coalition of North American Phenomenologists, the Society of Qualitative Inquiry in Psychology, and the International Human Science Research Conference. Professor Churchill has presented papers, workshops, and invited addresses at professional conferences around the world. He has authored a huge number of articles and book chapters in the field of phenomenological research method, empathy studies, human bonobo communication, and second-person perspective. His book, Essential of Existential Phenomenological Research, were published last year by the APA Books, which is the book that is showing us. Scott, thank you very much for being with us today. And it's a great pleasure to learn from you about applying phenomenology. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Francesca. And greetings. Good afternoon to all of you in Europe. Good morning to my colleagues here who are obviously not awake yet. So I am pulling up my PowerPoint. Oh, to share. Is that popping up now? Okay.
Yes, perfectly.
So I'm starting with the first slide being the advertisement or the image from the APA. What they did 3 years ago is they commissioned two series editors who I hadn't heard of before, Clara Hill and her student Sarah Knox. They were put in charge of a series of the essentials of qualitative methods. And for the APA, that was a big deal. I was involved in the division, the group that wanted to form a special section of the research division called Qualitative Inquiry. And ironically, we were left out. We meaning those of us who had spent 40, 50 years every year at APA, forging a path for qualitative research. And it was always phenomenological research. It started with Georgie and Connie Fisher from Duquesne and Fred and myself and Chris Anstus, regularly every year going. And finally, in 2010, they formed this section called SQUIP, the Society for Qualitative Inquiry. And then all of a sudden, there's this proliferation of methods and people are coming out of the woodwork, oh, I've been doing this since 2004, and I've been doing that since 2001. And they had put Jonathan Smith's book in there, figuring that he would cover interpretation and phenomenology. So why did they need someone to do phenomenology? And finally, someone apparently sent them an article I had written in 2018 for the journal Qualitative Psychology, which is APA. And they invited me to join, but they kept threatening, if you don't do this by this day, you're not going to be included. And then they made me cut 60% of what I had written during the pandemic. So it was a hard time, but I'm very happy that I got at least the color that I like for the book, and they didn't let me call it Doing Psychology Phenomenologically, which I thought was a descriptive title. They wanted me to name a method. So they came up with the title. I talked it over with Georgie. He said that really describes it very well. At Duquesne, we always called every course Existential Phenomenological Approach to Development, Perception, Cognition, what have you. So that title is not only one that's near and dear to my heart, because I've always identified as existential phenomenologist, but that was the definition of the Duquesne University doctoral program in psychology. And in using that title, I was trying to be a team player and saying, okay, I'm going to give the world, the synthesis of what I've put together in my understanding over 50 years. So I'll be telling you a bit of that story as we go. And now oh yeah, I go to the bottom of the page to move this thing on. So let's see, get this out of the way. So here's my front slide for today. And then, whoop, that just jumped away. Excuse me. There we go. And I mixed some of these slides together so they don't all have the same look to them. So existential phenomenological research, or doing psychology phenomenologically, is the title of the book and of the presentation. So I'm going to start with the conceptual foundations of this approach and what it means when we say a human science approach, because right off the bat, that term makes people think that the content is human. And in 2005 in Bournemouth, when I invited Jane Goodall, who I'd become friendly with, to be a keynote at the Human Science Conference, I made the point, and Georgie was in the audience, to say that it was unfortunate that people understood the word human that way, because that's not what Geisteswissenschaft means, and I'm going to be getting around to that. It refers more to the how, as Heidegger says, with which the what that is to be studied will be dealt with. Georgie himself, though, understood the human as the subject matter, because he wasn't someone who spoke German. So when he heard that Geisteswissenschaft had always been translated as human studies, I thought that was funny, because Naturwissenschaft is natural science, but somehow it gets demoted from science to study when it becomes the human sciences, the social sciences, the psychological sciences. So to his credit, Georgie reclaimed the word science for phenomenological psychology and calling his book Psychology as a Human Science. But I'm going to try to make a little more clear what that means. So what we mean when we call it a way of seeing has to do with the secret of the word Geisteswissenschaften, because, and I ran this by a couple of German scholar friends of mine before I went anywhere with this. It's Naturwissenschaft, nature science, science of nature, but Geist is not the word there. It's Geistes, which is the genitive. In English, it's like an apostrophe S. It means the spirit's science, the spirit's way of knowing. Heidegger's definition of Wissenschaft, Wissen, knowing, schaffen, creating. So the word for science in German means to create knowledge. And it's the way of creating knowledge that belongs to Geist, that belongs to the human spirit, which is parallel to what Dilthey says, that in using Verstehen, or understanding, we're using all of the powers of the psyche, not just thinking, not just cognition, but intuition, imagination, emotions, remembering, the whole field of what we bring with us to the encounter with the world, when we go outside, when we meet our friends, when we go to the zoo, when we go to a museum. All of our powers of Verstehen, which in the German, as I understand it, is a compassionate kind of understanding and not only a theoretical thing. So Dilthey summed up his approach with his often quoted statement, Die Natur erklären wir, das Seelenleben verstehen wir. We explain nature, but we must understand psychological life. And of course, in English, right off the bat, if you're talking to undergraduates, words like explanation and understanding mean the same thing. But it was actually Karl Jaspers in 1913 in his, later editions, but in the original text, the same year as Husserl's ideas, the great psychopathologist and psychiatrist, Karl Jaspers, based his entire 1,000-page general psychopathology on Dilthey's distinction. And rather than saying we should be doing a verstehende Psychologie instead of an erklärende psychology, he said we need both. But in Jasper's approach, we use verstehen, and we use the method he called the empathic method. We use empathy to understand our patients, and we use description as far as we can take description And when we can no longer describe what meets our eyes and our experience, that's when we need hypotheses. And that's when an explanatory psychology comes in to supplement the one founded in understanding. Now, Vandenberg reverses that in his book, A Different Existence, and says hypotheses emerge where the description of the psychological has stopped too soon. So whether we say that verstehen and description is the first thing we do, and then we resort to explanations and hypotheses afterward, or whether we go along with Vandenberg and say, well, you've stopped too soon if you've gone to explanations, we make that distinction following Dilthey as our source, as the methodologist. The APA Division 5, which is Qualitative and Quantitative Inquiry, gave his presidential address this year in Minneapolis at the APA convention, basically saying, whatever happened to methodology? Because half of my colleagues who are not phenomenologists, when they hear the word methodology, that only means one thing to them: methods. In fact, when I said for the handbook, I just wrote a chapter 4 for APA, when I told the editor, when he asked me, what do you want to write on? I'll give you first choice. I said methodology. So what did he strap me with? A comparison of the existing qualitative methods in humanistic psychology. And he gave somebody else human science, because he didn't understand that methodology means the articulation of your theory of science, what Fichte called Wissenschaftslehre in German, which is translated either as theory of science or science of knowledge. But it basically means the underlying theoretical and epistemological assumptions on the basis of which you've developed your psychology. So I'm going to, first of all, give my total devotion and honoring here Amedeo Giorgi, who in 1970, when he published Psychology as a Human Science, a phenomenologically based approach, this is the landmark book that set everything in motion in America, at least with regard to phenomenological method. And he wrote that book after several years of traveling to Europe, going to every center where there were people doing phenomenological philosophy, even through the Netherlands, where you had the Dutch phenomenological psychologists, asking all of them, is there a method that you use based on the phenomenological approach? And what he found out after years of going over from school to school to school was there was no method. There was only this methodology that was a promise for one day there being a method. Almost like Sartre at the end of Being and Nothingness, on page 735, with only another 100 pages to go, he says, ontology abandons us here. Its final formulations become the first principles of an existential psychoanalysis. But this psychoanalysis has not yet found its Freud. Sartre would become the first existential psychoanalyst in his version of it by writing his analyses, his existential biographies of Baudelaire, Genet, and Flaubert. But my point here is that Sartre, whose Being and Nothingness was the foundation for the Duquesne psychology program until Being and Time was translated in '62 and slowly absorbed by the philosophers and taught to the psychologists. During the '60s, it was Sartre's Being and Nothingness that was the foundational text at Duquesne, because there was the guy who took 735 pages to lay out an ontology, an ontological, which was fascinatingly a Hegelian dialectical ontology. I won't go into that here, but that's a whole different workshop. The idea I'm trying to get across here is that this is not simply about a series of steps to collect data and break it into parts and transform it into psychological meaning and then write a synthesis of that. Every method of qualitative research involves reading and rereading your data and breaking it into manageable units and reflecting on those units in some way, and then coming up with your results. But the key to this method, which originated in my first teacher, Paul Calaise's dissertation, which was, under Giorgi's supervision, but it was Calaise who came up with the sequential series of steps as a way of doing an empirical version of what he understood the phenomenological philosophers to be doing. And Giorgi said, this is great. This is the method we've been looking for. But Calaise, being a Heideggerian, didn't want to systematize it because he said that would be inauthentic. Each phenomenologist must in his or her own way take up this phenomenological approach. And if you move the steps around a little bit, that's fine. And people like Van Manen have said that as well. And even Jonathan Smith has said that. And often Georgi publishes a critique of them on the basis of, well, this is not science anymore because you're not following a replicable procedure. There has to be a replicable procedure of data handling. Otherwise, we don't really have a method. The one thing that was never clear, though, because we used to ask Andy, how do you go from the data to your findings? And what he always told us in the 70s was, well, I tell people that I try to assume an attitude that I have learned from reading Merleau-Ponty's Phenomenology of Perception, which ironically is exactly what Van Manen says in 1990 in his first research book on researching lived experience. He says, people ask me how I came up with my existentials, which he took from his teacher Vandenberg. And he says, well, I tell them I've read Merleau-Ponty's Phenomenology of Perception. And maybe if you were to read that book, you too might come up with these guiding concepts. So two of the great founders of phenomenological method in the human sciences, Georgi in psychology and Van Manen in pedagogy, pointed originally to Merleau-Ponty as who they read so that they could try to channel that when they analyzed data. But as far as identifying any part of the cognitive or intellectual processes of what you were doing, outside of Georgi, of course, always citing the epoche and the reduction, but none of us could ever figure out what those terms really meant. We just knew they were usually used synonymously at Duquesne. But when I read Natanson, that's when I first realized, the epoche is the pathway to the reduction. And Schutz, who clarifies that every attitude has its implicit epoche. Every attitude, every form of focusing has that which you are not focusing on. And so the epoche is the preliminary step by which we take out of play unwanted beliefs and assumptions, including the belief that the world as it appears to me actually exists. That's the transcendental phenomenologist's epoche, because they want to reflect on their own transcendental constituting acts in a Kantian way. What are the universal structures of not just human consciousness? That would be a phenomenological psychology, said Husserl. But for a transcendental phenomenology, what would be the transcendental structures of any consciousness? Whale consciousness, chimpanzee consciousness, angel, demon, God, all of these things Husserl referred to in the ideas and the phenomenological psychology as the scope, the grand ambitious scope that he placed before him as a transcendental philosopher. And why? Because he was wanting to establish the epistemological foundations for philosophers doing philosophy. If you're going to talk about the world and claim this about the mind and claim that about matter, don't you first need to clarify what are the structures of human consciousness, the transcendental schemata, through which the philosopher comes up with their most generic understanding of what conscious life can be? Well, we all try to follow along with Husserl, but we only can go so far, peeking into his transcendental reflections. And then we follow him when he says, however, there is the vocational attitude of the psychologist, for example, and there the socio-historical world is revealed to us as the ultimate context of communal life within which individual subjectivity must always be understood. So it's someone like Husserl saying this about the life world as the foundation and the context within which the work of phenomenological psychology would take place. That's a methodological statement. That tells us what the purview is of what we can approach as psychologists or sociologists or transcendental philosophers. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So, and this quote here from Dilthey, what he's saying by eschewing explanation is that we're not looking for efficient causation. If you take Aristotle's four causes, the material, the efficient, the formal, and the final, it's the final cause that we've always been needing in psychology. It's the reason why Ernie Keene, before he retired, gave an address at APA whatever happened to the psyche in psychology? Where did that go? And what happened is we reduced the psyche to being a brain, the mereological fallacy, attributing agency to something that can't be an agent. The brain is not the agent. It's the brain attached to the entire body of the human being or the dog or the whale in the healthy body of this organism. It's the organism that is the agent, never a part of it. And yet high school students today, who I am asked to talk to, are all anxious to study psychology because they just learned from their teacher that their brain is what decided that they would get out of bed this morning. And their brain is going to decide who they're going to marry and what their career is going to be. So if I can study psychology, I can understand the brain, and the brain is, this is the ultimate reduction, in my physiological psych textbook in college. We're going to study the principles that govern the individual neuron, because to understand the neuron is to understand the nervous system, and to understand the nervous system is to understand the person. This is right out of the Discourse on Method by Descartes. To understand the whole, you break it down to the smallest part, understand those principles, and from those principles alone, you deduce the principles governing the whole. And Dilthey's analysis is the complete opposite. You don't look at the whole from the point of view of the part. You look at the part from the point of view of the whole. So these are the kinds of principles that Georgi quoted in his book, Psychology as a Human Science. It's just, that book is loaded with quotations taken out of Dilthey in particular, and to some extent Brentano, the predecessor, because it was those principles that told Georgi there's got to be a better way to do science. There's got to be a better way to do a science of psychology. And that book was a plea to his colleagues, because he just got his doctorate in the early 60s from Fordham in experimental psychology on the psychophysics of visual sensation. He once jumped all over me for saying in an article that he did his dissertation on perception. He said, if you're going to do the history of phenomenology, get it right. I didn't study perception, I studied sensation. And Magnus has a copy of his dissertation in his file that he showed me. It's 65 pages, typewritten with corrections written in ink. You couldn't get away with that today. But anyway, I still consider him kind of the master of all of this. Now, I just lost my screen, so let me see what I have to do to get it back. There we go. Okay. All right. So Dilthey named the human sciences the Geisteswissenschaften. I don't know if everyone on the call here is on board with that, or if you're familiar with that term, but okay. All right. Now I'm going to go to the, oh, geez, it keeps jumping off of the screen. Wait a second. What do I have to do to get this thing back? It seems to be on the other page. Excuse me. I'm going to stop sharing and then bring it back up. Okay. That's what I'll have to do. Okay, there's my control at the bottom. So let's cut to the chase. What do I consider the key insight of existential phenomenology? Aside from the foundations in Dilthey and Brentano and Husserl, is the concept of existential freedom. Perhaps the most important, which is on the next slide, I think, it comes out of Heidegger in Being and Time, where he says, Das Wesen des Daseins liegt in seinem Zusein. The essence of Dasein lies in its to be, which can also be translated being. But then in the next paragraph, he reiterates it and he puts the word existens. And for Heidegger, existens just doesn't mean existence. It means comporting oneself toward one's existence. You got to chew on that for a while. What does that mean for the psychologist, for the patient who's sitting in front of you? If you're doing an existential approach, you're asking yourself, how does this person navigate their way through their circumstances? Not how do their circumstances have an effect on them. I enter my senior thesis seminar and I get a class of 30 students each year who want to study the effect of social exclusion on the individual, the effect of the loss of the child on the parent, the effect of the divorce of the parents on the child, the effect. And this is after 1 year of them having Heidegger run down their throat sometimes, but they're still thinking in terms of cause and effect. And I have to try to reframe that. It takes me half of the year to rehabilitate their thinking, to stop looking for the psychology to be the study of effects instead of the study of choices. So that's why in the book I said, I'm just going to cut right to the clearest statement of this. He may not be a methodologist, but he survived Auschwitz. Viktor Frankl said, the greatest of human freedoms is the freedom to choose one's own attitude in any given set of circumstances. The freedom to choose your attitude. You know, that just rings true for every person sitting in the room. When you say that, the students start nodding their head. They understand it. So the first reading I signed before the beginning of my 3-semester sequence in phenomenological research at the undergraduate level, a year ago, 2 Christmases ago, I assigned them to read Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. And then when we got to school, I had them read Yes to Life, which trotzdem wir müssen Ja zum Leben sagen. In spite of everything, we must say yes to life. This was a song that the inmates in Auschwitz were forced to sing. In spite of it all, we must say yes to life. And Frankl turned it into something positive. That became like the basis of his logotherapy. We have to teach people how to affirm and grasp onto their dignity, whatever is left of that, their power to choose, their agency, because the whole thing that they were suffering was an order of terror that was aimed at stripping the human being of their agency and their dignity. And so his whole philosophy and therapy, Viktor Frankl, is how do we hang on to our power to choose? For Heidegger, we're inextricably bound. Oh, let's see, I can't read my own slide here because this picture's in the way, so I'm going to move it. For Heidegger, we're inextricably bound, tied to both our future in terms of our aims, our goals, and anticipations, and our situatedness, our being in the throe of life. Hence, we are a thrown projection. That's an interesting play on the German Werfen. When I was doing my sabbaticals twice in 97 and 2004 in Germany, I was always bugging my Goethe Institute German teachers with Heidegger's terminology like Gelassenheit, and in this case, Geworfenheit. And they said, well, you know, it's very simple. In German, we have this expression you probably do in English, to be in the throw of things. And they said that verb is werfen, to throw, but it also is throwing, to be in the throw. And it also has the past, ich bin geworfen, I can't remember the right way of saying it, but to have been thrown. And there's the future, Antwerfen. The Antwerf is Heidegger's term for projection. And you lose the etymology in all of Heidegger when you read him in translation, because you don't think that thrownness and projection and fallenness and any of these terms have any connection. But for Heidegger, to study the way that the human being is in the throe of life is to understand that we always make projections, and then we have to take up where we find ourselves after we've made the choices that we've made. It may feel to us like we're stuck with all of these assignments we have to do as college students, for example, or professors with too much on our plate. But after all, we made our own bed and now we're sleeping in it. We've already made certain choices, and these choices that we've already made become part of our facticity, part of our factical life, which was Heidegger's earlier way of referring to existence before he centered on existenz and Dasein in being and time. In the early lecture courses on Aristotle and on ontology and the hermeneutics of facticity, his term was factical life. That was the way he characterized human existence. And then existence just became a better term, especially in English. So the statement I gave you earlier from Heidegger, das Wesen des Daseins, the essence of Dasein lies in its to be. Interestingly, Sartre quotes in Being and Nothingness early on, like page 65 somewhere in the English, he quotes the German of Hegel. Wesen ist was gewesen ist, a beautiful play on words. Because in German, the verb to be, sein, in the first person singular is ich bin. In the past, ich war. I'm speaking like a Bavarian when I say ich. Sorry, Francesca, you've been around that in Freiburg, yeah? Those Bavarians, we're drinking beer, yeah? So anyway, the Wesen, and then to say I have been, you say ich bin gewesen. And it's interesting that the part of the word for to say I have been, gewesen, Wesen is the word in German for essence. So in this Hegelian rendition, my essence is what I have been. And for Heidegger, that only defines my situatedness, my throneness, my facticity. Much more important to Heidegger is where I go with this having been. And that's the to be or not to be. That's where he gets this essence. It's almost as if he's directly dialoguing with Hegel. So Hegel says, ja, Wesen ist was gewesen ist. And Heidegger says, nein, das ist nicht alles. Das Wesen des Daseins liegt in seinem Zusein, Dummkopf. Right? So, following Heidegger, let me move this out of the way. Sartre asserted that there's no determinisms in psychological life. We are ultimately without excuse. For Sartre, the past does not cause the present, but our future pitched goals in the present moment create the meaning of our immediate past as a situation within which we are challenged to find our bearings. And finding our bearings is not a matter of saying, which psychiatric drug should I take this morning to control my thought patterns? And nor is it a matter of saying, who caused me to be angry? And listen to the everyday speech. He pissed me off. She made me jealous. When we collect descriptions of human emotions, if you just took them at face value, which is what most qualitative researchers do, then all you're doing is bestowing the accent of reality, as Schutz would say, on the self-deceptions of your data, of your participants. But listening with the third ear, to borrow a concept from Theodore Reich, what we're listening for is the intentionality. Let me give a quick example. My most recent research seminar last week, one of the brightest students in the class is studying the female experience of the alienating gaze. And she's describing it as not only feeling unseen, that's one of the code words that some of my students use, to feel seen or to feel unseen. But when the mode of feeling unseen takes the form of, to be using a Lacanian expression, to feel misrecognized. And the data was a description of a female whose boyfriend did not like it when she put on a certain dress. And he said, I wish you wouldn't wear that dress because it makes you look immodest. Well, all the women in the classroom, including my colleague, oh my gosh, he's shaming her. He's shaming her and he's objectifying her body and he's sexualizing her body. And I said, well, that's the everyday way of putting it. Just like the jealous man who says, my date is whispering in the corner with my roommate and that made me jealous. We don't know what they're whispering about. Maybe they're planning a surprise birthday party for him. His jealousy, the conditions of possibility of his jealousy is not what's happening across the room. It's his vulnerability, his insecure masculinity. It's his project to have territorial possession of his date. You have to look to the intentionality to understand the jealousy. And in the same way, I got my head chewed off for doing this, but I said, look, I want to ask you, what is the meaning context within which she was offended by being called immodest? I said, put your phenomenological thinking cap on here. The reduction, reducere in Latin, is to lead ourselves back to. What are we leading ourselves back from is where she went with the social construction of reality that I was being shamed and he turned my body into an object. I said, Sartre said in Sexual Desire, I don't desire I desire a human being in a situation, not an insect or a mollusk. And what was Sartre saying is that it's the expressive body, to use Merleau-Ponty's expression, that I desire. And it was the expressive body that was being shamed, if anything was being shamed. She wasn't being shamed for having a body. She was being shamed for his misperception of her intention to immodestly reveal or show her body. He was calling her a provocateur, basically. He was saying, I don't want other people looking at you. But it wasn't reducing her to her legs or to any body part that were revealed by the dress. He was not responding to the Cartesian body, which is how many people end up framing. There's even a term in the literature, self-objectification. I said, how do you know she wasn't subjectifying herself when she put that dress on? She wanted to feel the power of being, her claim was she wanted to be pretty, attractive, but not a provocateur, not immodest. And my point is that in my attempt to take up Dilthey's compassionate understanding, I may be a guy who's never put a dress on, but I can imagine that when she was putting on her dress, her lived experience was an expression of the intentionality of looking pretty, which were her own words, and his calling her immodest. That's not a description of the Cartesian body or what Sartre's second ontological mode of the body is in his Hegelian dialectic. The body for others is an object. That's an extreme mental exercise he went through, because the ultimate synthesis is where Merleau-Ponty goes, the lived body. And when a person is being looked at, it's the expressive body, the intentional body that is being perceived. And maybe a certain male gaze wants to see a submissive person. I said, don't be so, this student had in her title, the self and the body is, she was trying to deal with the fact that on the one hand, I'm a self, and on the other hand, I'm a body. I said, this is like Descartes. So we just spent a whole year reading Heidegger and Sartre and Merleau-Ponty so that you could better understand your own body. So I said, I encourage you to read some of these. I had to read chapters 5 and 6 of the Phenomenology of Perception, part 1, the body in its sexual being and the body as expression and speech. And said, only when you can understand the expressive body as the intentional body can you understand your data. Otherwise, you're just joining forces with traditional psychologists and saying, oh, you've been objectified, you've been sexualized. And then she has no agency. So what I'm getting at is that whether you're a therapist or a researcher, listening for the intentional context, the meaningful context is important. And Magnus, you'll remember that in Larry Davidson's book, his critique is that if you identify the intentions of someone, you're basically blaming the victim. And in the case of psychopathology, you're saying that the patient has chosen their medical disorder, which is not. He said you're entering into a transcendental psychologism because you're explaining their behavior as caused by their intentions. I said, no, I'm not doing that. I'm trying to understand compassionately what this person who wrote the description was going through when she got up that morning and with the best of intentions put on her prettiest dress, and then her boyfriend said it was immodest. Was the dress immodest? Were the legs that were showing immodest? Or was she being accused of her intentions being immodest? And what felt violating to her ultimately, I think, was that she was not recognized in what her intentionality was. And I'm not saying it caused anything, except that it's the context within which I understand how offended she felt. Okay, I'm going too far into the data analysis, but I want to kind of make clear that there's kind of some profound implications for this methodology in terms of how we end up conceptualizing things. It's in the face of our circumstances that we choose how to act or who we shall be. And our choices are not always deliberate intentions, which is why we need the phenomenologist or the psychotherapist listening with the third ear to reveal us to ourselves. we need an other-sided point of view on us sometimes. And that means that you can't always rely on the data. I did a paper 20 years ago for the Journal of Phenomenological Psych called Seeing Through Self-Deceptions in Narrative Reports, Finding Methodological Virtue in Problematic Data. Because especially with emotions, the data is always going to be giving explanations of behavior and justifications. And how do we see through those impure reflections, to use Sartre's term? How do we see through the naturalistic prejudice that's being expressed by our participants? Because if we're phenomenological psychologists, we really have to go beyond that. I'm looking at the time here. So where am I? Am I needing to wrap up pretty soon? I've hardly gotten, okay, I'm going to go through the rest.
You have more or less 20 minutes.
Wonderful. Das ist sehr gut. Okay, so Sartre turns this into pure and impure reflection. And he gets the idea of pure out of Husserl's ideas, purifying. Sartre argued that we engage in impure reflection, either as psychologists or as people writing descriptions, when we attribute what Schutz called because motives to justify our behavior. One of the problems with saying, as our students always do, think back to a time when you felt offended by the other's gaze. Well, when you ask someone to think back to a time, you're putting them into the perspective of the past, looking back on the past. And what they always tend to do is to look for the immediate cause of their behavior or their experience, the emotion, the jealousy, the anger, the frustration, the disappointment, the hurt, the being offended, always seem to have been caused by something that somebody said. And what was Schutz saying in his wisdom? Only when we can put the actor back into the living moment of their action do the in order to motives appear. Well, when you're reading data that has already been cast in the light of because motives, because that's what we naturally do when we look back on experience in self-deceptive psychological determinism, looking for something to blame our experience on, Sartre has to come along using the empathic method, putting himself into the living moment of the person's experience and trying both compassionately and imaginatively to make present the intentions that might have been there in that living moment. And then if you're doing an interview, you can ultimately check those intuitions out with the person. Usually when you put your finger on the intentionality, it's so clearly descriptive of their experience. They open their eyes and go, oh my gosh, that perfectly describes what I was going through. I just didn't know how to say it. So what I'm saying here is that as a phenomenological psychologist who takes his methodology seriously, in this case, Sartre's analysis of the ontological modes of the body and his analysis of the two kinds of reflection, the impure reflection of everyday self-deception and the purifying reflection of the phenomenological reduction. That's exactly the phrase in English translation that Sartre uses at the end of his book on emotions. He puts it all together in one phrase, the purifying reflection of the phenomenological reduction. It's like somewhere page 88 or something in the English translation of the emotions. The purifying reflection of the phenomenological reduction. This helps us to uncover this method of reflection to help us see the field of human choices as revealed in the way that we confront our circumstances. It helps illuminate what Schutz called the in order to motives that have their basis in our future pitched goals and choices. It helps us see the final cause of our intentionality. In Sartre's little book on emotions, after chapter 1, how many, I don't know if you've all read it, but you all should, it's only 90 pages. After the first 20 pages where he introduces the meaning of phenomenological psychology, he was probably the first to define it. He says it's the study of people and situations. And then in the next first chapter, he does the classical theories. He says, well, these are all reductionistic. We need to turn to something else. Chapter 2 is the psychoanalytic point of view. And what does he get from the psychoanalytic perspective? He calls it the principle of finality. When I read that when I was 19 years old in a philosophy class, I had no idea what the word finality meant. And the teacher didn't explain it either. So that was always a stumbling block. And then finally, as a grad student, I said, wait a minute, he's talking about Aristotle's final cause, the principle of finality, the implicit goal, the implicit intention. Why did we find that in psychoanalysis? You know, Merleau-Ponty said the relationship of phenomenology to psychoanalysis is that they're both aiming at the same latency. What's this same latency that psychoanalysis and phenomenology are both aiming at? Well, first of all, you should know that Edmund Husserl and Sigmund Freud were students of the same philosophy professor, an Austrian named Franz Brentano, who borrowed from the medieval philosophers the notion of consciousness as intentional, as always being directed beyond itself. And Husserl, the philosopher, said, I'm going to call that intentionality. And what did Freud do? He took that ball and ran with it into the unconscious. And in 1895, because that's when he was studying with Brentano, just prior to that, he wrote his studies on hysteria with Joseph Breuer. And in each of the 4 Freudian case histories, guess what? The term that is most reviled by phenomenologists who don't read Freud, the term most reviled in Freud is repression. Because in his metapsychology papers in 1914 and 15, he took a stab at trying to explain repression and turn it into a mechanism. And they use that as the ultimate alienating concept because it's saying that we have some mechanism going on causing us to repress things. You know, everywhere Freud uses the term repression in his studies on hysteria, almost every time, there's an adjective in front of it. And what do you think the adjective is? Intentional. Intentional repression. Intentional repression, not mechanistic repression, not intention, not repression is some mechanism that is causing your behavior. Freud's gift was taking Brentano's concept of consciousness as intentional and taking it into our dreams, our parapraxes, our slips of the tongue, and ultimately into our symptoms and our emotions, which are always symptoms, always pointing to something else. And what are they pointing to? What does the phenomenological reduction lead us back to? We start with the emotion. We start with the jealousy. We start with the anger toward the parent figure, but it leads us back to our hurt, our anger, our fears, and our intention to take those things out of our mind. Freud saw the intentionality, the unconscious intentionality of the subject. That's not too far away from what was happening in the classroom last week when the student was too quick to want to blame the girl's boyfriend for causing her to feel bad about herself by objectifying her. All he did was reflect back the intentions that he perceived, perhaps wrongly, but it had more to do with intentions than anything else, just as all of Freud's discoveries are discoveries of intentionality. And only in that one little period in the 14 and 15, volume 10 of the collected works of Freud, does he dabble in the Dilthey explanatory approach to try to use his concepts as explanatory concepts. But if you put those writings aside and read his early case histories, he's a master of studying intentionality. And you might say that his approach to symptoms, the secret is to say, what is the in order to motive? It was the Gestalt psychologists like Fritz Perls who would have a person try on a statement. So, well, instead of saying that your girlfriend made you jealous, can you finish this sentence? I make myself jealous in order to, and then you fill in the blank. Fritz Perls was already using Schutz's in order to motives, probably without ever having read Schutz, but because it was kind of the obvious thing to understand your symptoms, you got to ask, what are you getting from them? What is the symptom doing for you? What's your motive for that symptom? What's the unconscious intentionality for that symptom? I'm going to move ahead from this because I'm hardly anywhere that I wanted to be at this point. That's enough. I'm going to have Francesca make this available to everyone. So I put data in here. This would take forever to read. So I'm going to tell you that I've got some data where we had someone describing her feeling alone, and we tried to thematize the intentionality in the context of this feeling alone and the feeling sad. And so I take you through pieces of the data to meaning unit analysis, and then to a formulation, a structural summary of that data. But we won't do that here. To sort of sum up the notion of existential freedom from Sartre, the alarm that rings in the morning is not the reason I get out of bed to start my day. If the alarm has any significance, it's the meaning that it has for my project to be, in this case, to realize myself as the kind of person who gets to work on time. This is this temporal structure, what Sartre calls the primordial temporality of all of our actions. In the book, I try to use a very simple example. The mother who admonishes her son because he just hit his little brother. The mother says, "Why did you hit your little brother?" "Because he hit me first." Well, you put him into the attitude of the past, according to Schutz. He's looking for the because motive. He may even say, in order to get even. There's an in order to motive, but that's too superficial. That's not enough. So what Schutz and Sartre ultimately want are the deeper intentions, in order to motives. And if we use the Sartrean approach, you might say that that little boy who hit his brother for irritating him was wanting to realize himself in the moment as the kind of person who doesn't take nonsense from anybody, including his little brother. The self that awaits him in the future is the person who will not be bullied or annoyed by others if you play with it. And the point is that the underlying intention, the motivation for the act, is not a simple act of violence. It's not simply getting even. It's not because he hit me first. It's in order to be the kind of person who doesn't take this kind of nonsense. And the mother might say, is that the kind of boy you want to grow up to be? The kind of person who hurts other people to get even with them because you feel that you can't be bullied, that kind of thing. So the point again is that there's, even in the simplest little examples of everyday life, these ways that intentionality is at the bottom. There's no excuses. We're responsible for our actions. Do I stay off the grass in the public park because of the sign that says keep off the grass? Or does the sign, like the alarm that rings in the morning, only have the weight that my free project and the self to be realized confers upon it? It's our goal as phenomenologists to observe and thematize what are often the latent intentionalities. That's what Freud did. In the first chapter of my book, I took my hat off to Husserl. I said, the method that I'm describing, the how of this method, includes the epoche, but there's not the epoche. There's as many epoche. Husserl had the transcendental epoche, the phenomenological epoche, the epistemological epoche. He names the life world epoche, intuition. My gosh, when I was a grad student, I wanted to know, what is this intuition? All phenomenological understandings are grounded in intuition, and I felt I was bereft of intuition. Everybody around me must have more insight into human behavior than me. Little did I know that the best way to understand intuition was to take the German Anschauung and break it down to the verb anschauen, on, at, schauen, looking, or taking note of, looking at. What Husserl was saying was not that you recoil into the interiority of your own mind and hunches and guess at things. He was saying you have to look at, you have to encounter. In the Logical Investigations, Volume 2, in the German, I remember it's page 6 or 8, I forget which one, but he says, "Wir wollen auf die Sachen selbst zurückgehen und wollen wir uns zur Evidenz bringen." We want to go back to the matters themselves and bring ourselves to the evidence. He doesn't say the things themselves. He would have said die Dingen selbst. But I wrote to the editor of Husserliana, Rokas Zova, who I met 10 years ago. And I said, what does this Sachen selbst mean? He said, well, I said, because that's what everyone says is the battle cry of phenomenology. And he laughed. He said, it's hardly a battle cry. In fact, I just found it last week in Hegel's Phenomenology of the Spirit. One of my grad students was reading it in the German, and there I see die Sachen selbst. I said, oh my God, it's already there. He told me that at the turn of the last century in Germany, scientists referred to their subject matter by the generic expression, unsere Sachen selbst, die Sachen selbst, my subject matter. And Husserl says, we want to go back to the matters themselves, die Sachen selbst, of our discipline. And it was in the ideas that he says that the Sachen that we are studying are the Sachen of Bewusstsein, of consciousness. What are the affairs of consciousness? The noeses, the transcendental schemata, to borrow from Kant for Husserl's transcendental phenomenology. The affairs, the Sachen that he wanted to study were not things like Cartesian objects. They were the living moment, the how of my intentionality. It was intentionality itself that were die Sachen selbst for the phenomenologist. And he wanted to bring himself to evidence. He was the first evidence-based phenomenologist. You know, we talk about that expression all the time in American science, to be evidence-based. And by the way, when he says we want to go back in German, what else is that but the Latin reducere, or reduction? So even if Zahavi says that nowhere in the logische Untersuchungen, there's no mention of the reduction, I said back to Dan, well, what about wir wollen auf die Sachen selbst zurückgehen? Isn't zurückgehen descriptively saying to go back to reducere, to lead ourselves back to? We want to go back from the experiences of everyday life to the affairs of consciousness that are the conditions of possibility for human experience. They're not things themselves. It's the comedy that Sartre said, my gosh, when he read the ideas in Berlin, he came back to Paris and he was in the cafe and he held up an apricot cocktail and he said, why, we could even do a philosophy of this apricot cocktail. That's why the book by Sarah Bakewell is called At the Existentialist Cafe, on being, nothingness, and apricot cocktails, something like that. So we use bracketing, we use intuition, but not, well, we use intuition in the sense of that word in the Latin. It's the same word in German as in English, intuition, but Husserl preferred anschauen, presumably because it was more sensual. Schau, it had to do with using your senses, your bodily presence, instead of just wissen, knowing. It's more like kennen. You know, in German, the two words for knowing. Kennst du Magnus? Nein, ich kenne ihn nicht, aber ich weiß ihn. I don't know him from acquaintance, but I know of him. So scientific knowledge is a kind of knowledge about, but phenomenology invites us to use our powers of anschauen, of looking at, of encountering, in order to know in that sense of kennen in German, K-E-N-N-E-N. Do you know through your encounters what I'm talking about here? Okay, so the difference between a mere knowledge excuse me, my screen keeps on playing these tricks with me. How do I get back to it? It's doing this thing where I lose the whole image, the whole slide, and I have to monkey with the screen to get it to come back. What am I going to do here? Excuse me. If I can find
it's okay. It's okay. Perhaps you can try to stop sharing the screen and perhaps you will recover it.
Hold it. Okay, now I'm back to you. Now I go to share screen. Okay, we back? Sorry about that.
Yes, we are back. Don't worry.
Okay, play from current slide. There we go. So enough of that. So the what of EPR are the latent intentionalities, the meanings, the motivations, the implicit goals. The how is the empathic method by which we resonate with these meanings in the lives of others. More formally refer to these as the epistemological and ontological foundations of our discipline. So getting started. Our time is what, about 5, 10, or no, how do I, yeah. So I'm gonna do this part quickly. I took my guide here from my own dissertation where I was wanting to access clinical intuition. I was wanting to access the mode of perceiving, thinking that led to insights about a person's personality. And I had to locate that study somewhere. Well, I decided to locate it in the assessment interview for various reasons. And so the assessment interview became the situation that I selected to manifest my phenomenon, which was clinical intuition. My best friend at the time was studying intercorporeality, inspired by Merleau-Ponty's Visible and the Invisible, and he decided to locate his study in the study of improvisational dance. Dance was the situation he selected to manifest intercorporeality. Diagnostic assessment was the situation I selected to study clinical intuition. Here I'm at Duquesne University in the 70s. And you know what the faculty all thought? They all told me that my phenomenon was the assessment interview, and my research question was, how does an assessment happen? And they told my friend, your phenomenon is dance. And your research question is, how does in dance happen? Both of us were alienated from our projects because none of our mentors knew how to apply phenomenology. And I put in the methodological contributions of my dissertation the distinction between the situation and the phenomenon that reveals it. That was the language I used. And I used an analogy from Heidegger's Being and Time on anxiety, where he talks about the difference between that in the face of which I'm anxious and that about which I'm anxious. And I said, there's that in the face of which I have clinical intuition or experience intercorporeality, and there's that about which, what is the intentionality? No one could understand this. My dissertation director told me after 7.5 years when I went to defend, the day before my defense, that she finally read my analysis the night before, and she said, I think I finally understand what you've been doing all this time. That's how they guided you at Duquesne. So I'm teaching Being and Time, and I come across on page 25 in the English, page 25, the very beginning, section 2, the structure of an inquiry, which you get a much better rendition of in the prolegomena to the history of the concept of time, is 1925 lecture course. That was the second draft of Being and Time. It's around page 186, 187, somewhere in there, where he's got 2 pages on this, but I'm going to boil it all down for you. Every inquiry has that which is called for in the first place, the Erfragte, which can also be used to refer to the findings at the end. What is the purpose of the study? What is being called for? Erfragte, fragen, asking, inquiring, calling for. And Heidegger says, this purpose of your research already gives you a clue as to what it's about. The research phenomenon, if you're a phenomenologist, is what's being asked about. I was asking about clinical intuition. My friend was asking about intercorporeality. And then Heidegger says, every inquiry has that which must be investigated directly. The Befragte. If you put that word in Google Translate, do you know what you get in English? The interviewee. The one interrogated, the one asked. The threefold structure of any inquiry. Here I'm at Duquesne, and not a single one of the mentors or the faculty know Heidegger or Husserl well enough to understand that my friend is looking for intentionality in the form of intercorporeality. I'm looking for it in the form of clinical intuition. I'm using Schutz's phenomenology of the social world and Husserl's experience and judgment as my foundation. No one could grasp this, and what they all thought was that the situation interrogated was the phenomenon. And you know what? They're doing this to this day. There are students whose phenomena are lived experiences, and I keep saying, no, the lived experience is the situation. That's why Sartre says phenomenological psychology studies man in situations. The situations are what we interrogate. The situation is my lived experience of some circumstance. And what I'm trying to lead myself back to in the reducere reduction, in the zurückgehen, going back to the affairs of existential life, that's the phenomenon, the latent intentionality within the situation. It's such a simple distinction. But I have colleagues who will not go along with it because Georgie didn't say it. But I know that Magnus is smiling because he and I see eye to eye on this particular issue. I feel it's a very critical distinction. And so I did a whole paper in 2018, Explorations in Teaching the Phenomenological Method. And I used as a subtitle, Challenging Psychology Students to Grasp at Meaning in Narrative Data. And the reason I used that was because of this longstanding, unfortunate debate between description and interpretation. And people say, no, you got to be descriptive. You got to be descriptive. Can't have interpretation. Georgie doesn't like interpretation. I said, I know Georgie doesn't like interpretation because for him, that meant that you had a person coming in the room and using Freud or Jung or even Sartre or Heidegger concepts. And he wanted you to park your concepts at the door and just teach us how to be descriptive. I said, what do you think you're describing but your interpretations? And I could put a slide up here, if I could dig it up right now, by Husserl in German. I can't pronounce it well, but it's all intentional analyses, all self-understandings of consciousness that find their expression in description are Interpretationen. This is from Husserliana 39, The Life World, the untranslated second half of the Crisis. All intentional analyses, all self-understandings of consciousness that find their expression in description are interpretations. So I start my students by identifying a lived experience that they want to investigate. The problem is that most of the time, people don't start with a phenomenon. They don't start with some latent intentionality that they want to explore. That was my mistake and my friend Bruce's mistake. We picked a hidden latent phenomenon, and all that the faculty mentors were able to see was the situation. Even my closest mentors said, yeah, you're doing a process phenomenon, the process of assessment, the phenomenology of assessment. And he was doing the phenomenology of dance. I said, yeah, it's a phenomenology of dance about intercorporeality. It's a phenomenology of assessment about clinical intuition. So I wrote that article in 2018, and I'll send it to anyone who wants it, where I redundantly over and over again in every way I can imagine, try to make this distinction, because I find that without teaching someone to make the distinction between the phenomenon and the situation that's revealing it, you end up only summarizing the details of the situation and never leading yourself back to the intentionality. Oh my gosh, it's It's doing this again. There we go. You're right. If I just press stop screen sharing, it comes back. Hello, everyone. I'm almost done. Okay. There we go. All right. So it's a 10-year-old MacBook. What can I say? So, for example, one of our undergraduates had been influenced by reading Beauvoir. This is a different one, 3 years ago, in regard to the impact of the other's regard. And she was studying the conflict between how we feel of ourselves from the inside and the way we're perceived by others, very much like what the other student's doing. How is our intentionality with regard to being seen by the other revealing our sense of ourself, of our need to maintain or manage others' impressions of us? And what she ended up studying, the reason I'm using this example, is that I just gave you the distinction between the situation and the phenomenon. Her access question to the participant was, describe a situation in which you were seen without makeup, when you were specifically not expecting to be seen in that way. In the case that she analyzed was a girl who runs out to get the mail at 8 o'clock in the morning, and she runs into the boy who lives next door that she's got this enormous crush on. And he's seeing her with her hair up in rollers and, she doesn't have any makeup on. Describe the situation. Now notice, her research interest is not about makeup. It's not about person perception. It's not about interpersonal attraction. What she presents in the access question to get the data is the situation for the real research interest, which was something else. It was really the underlying experience of the other's regard and the intentionality within that intersubjectivity, experiencing the other within the we. That was the phenomenon. But the situation chosen to study was being caught without your makeup. And I hate to be sarcastic, but I can imagine in today's world, someone will say, I'm doing my doctoral dissertation on the phenomenon of being caught without your makeup on. That's not your phenomenon. That's the situation you selected to reveal it. And your phenomenon has something to do with the ambiguity of being a body, the ambivalent ways that we feel either objectified or subjectified. By the way, I wanted to say early, Anne Hathaway, when she was wearing the Catwoman suit in the movie Batman 20 years ago, was admonished by reporters for how do you feel about contributing to the objectification of women? And you know what Anne Hathaway, the actress, said? I never felt so powerful in my life than when I walked onto the set in that Catwoman costume. It was like the parting of the Red Sea. Everyone backed away and it was almost standing in awe. In awe of what? A sex object? No, a sexual subject. So putting on the makeup is a form of, impression management for Goffman. It's a way of why not self-subjectifying? Why is the term not self-subjectification? Well, perhaps that's where Larry Davidson's wanting to go to the socio-historical context and the social constructions of reality come in, because our habits today are to blame the perceiver. #MeToo. And what do we have? What do we live in a social world today where people are being more provocative, wearing more revealing outfits, almost daring you to look. My eyes are up here. Well, one psychoanalyst said to his patient, I will look at whatever you show me, as a way of blaming the victim, maybe, but trying to throw her back on her intentionality or his intentionality. That's a hot subject, so I should not stay with it too much. But I like to be provocative. So that was the title of her thing, Being in the Eye of the Beholder, a phenomenological inquiry into being seen by the other. Again, being seen by the other or caught without makeup, that's just the situation. That's what it was a study of, but it was a study about the eye of the beholder, the experience of the eye of the beholder, and how I feel either recognized or misrecognized, feeling seen or not seen. Kind of leading toward the end here about this approach, quoting Heidegger. The word phenomenology informs us of the how by means with which what is to be treated in the science gets handled. That was the problem with Jonathan Smith's IPA. I think originally when I met him 20 years ago, he confessed. He said, I feel a little embarrassed when I meet you folks from Duquesne because I didn't know you had a 50-year history of doing this. He said, I like the word phenomenology, and I thought this captures what I'm doing because I'm collecting these first-person reports. So interpretative phenomenological analysis, the method was interpretative, the data was phenomenological, and he spent the last 20 years basically, I would say, retrofitting that method to the literature so that to today's student reading that method, it's already been filled in with all of the references that were actually the foundational stuff at Duquesne, out of which our method was developed. And what's happening today is all kinds of different garden varieties of phenomenology are popping up, which are basically thematic analysis. And then they're calling it phenomenological because they read some Merleau-Ponty. I mean, Howard Pollio did that. He's a good guy. He's at Tennessee, University of Tennessee. I think he's retired now. But he did a book called The Phenomenology of Life World Experience, and it was based on his and his colleagues' readings of Merleau-Ponty. But he had written articles on thematic analysis, and when you actually read what their data analyses are, they're thematic analyses, meaning that they're staying with the kind of surface level, with what was reported by the subjects. You go to the Human Science Conference and you get these IPA studies, and the researchers have their little laser beam that they're shining a light on their data. That are their findings. The findings are the data. And I'm saying, no, the data is the starting point. There's got to be some value added. And the value added is that the phenomenologist finds their way back from the data to the latent intentionalities. So for me, the word phenomenology describes the how, the letting be, the attitude of encountering. It's a way of capturing meaning. And I will say that the Scandinavian nurses, when they point to their data as findings, there's a good reason for it, because I've noticed in their way of doing interviews, their empathic presence is so palpable in the way they even present the words of their informants. It's clear that it was their presence that was a sheltering place within which people could talk about the unthinkable, like what is it like to live with spinal cord injury? One of my friends has spent her whole life studying, but it's her particular mode of carrying empathic presence to the participant, such that the data are not really data, simple given to a blank slate consciousness. R.D. Lang suggests if we use a Latin word to refer to what we're studying, it should be capta, what we have captured, what is taken, what is been co-constituted by the empathic presence of the interviewer. And that's where I defer to Magnus, who's been doing for years now his empathy training workshops and with his doctoral students, because he understood implicitly as a phenomenologist, Magnus here, that it's in the empathic presence, which is not just that you use empathy in a cognitive empathy to understand data. I'm talking about the palpable human presence to the person that you're speaking to. In this presence, the other is able to come forth with statements that they wouldn't otherwise come forth with, and it's not unreal to call that findings, because it's your presence that has evoked it.
Scott, I'm sorry, we are running out of time. Yes, otherwise we will not have time for questions. I'm sorry.
Good. They can get the rest of this, from the, yeah. Here we go.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.